This is the third and final video in this series about the Grand Theft Auto Trilogy Definitive Edition for Nintendo Switch. More general topics like the game's controls were covered in the first video on GTA 3, so watch those previous two videos for a complete understanding of this definitive package with its many ups and downs. All the footage I caught as well was of version 1.0.5, which is no longer the current patch as the recently released version 1.0.6 does fix some stability issues and there is generally better performance from what I have seen, so the footage on screen won't necessarily reflect what people would see today. Prior to the events of the game, the Grove Street family was one of the many strong gangs in Los Santos, and it was led by Sweet Johnson, who had some siblings in the gang as well. In 1987, Sweet's youngest brother Brian was killed, and the other brother Carl Johnson didn't actually save him. We don't really know what Carl could have done if anything, but the point is Sweet does blame Carl for this, and this does cause a rift between the two living brothers. It doesn't really matter what happened, but we get to see how the two brothers get to deal with the aftermath of this. Carl leaves Los Santos to get away from it all, and he spends the next 5 years in Liberty City. And honestly, on its own right, this is wonderfully written, but it does speak to me on a more personal level, as someone who has had to cut a brother out of my life. However, Carl, or CJ as he's more usually known and I'll pretty much exclusively refer to him as, does have to return home to Los Santos, as 5 years after his leaving, their mother passed away. She was gunned down in a drive-by shooting with some unknown assailants. Once CJ gets back to Los Santos, he takes a taxi from the airport to his family home, but en route he's intercepted by police. This is actually specifically Crash, a group within the police that are here to crack down on the gang's presence, but it's actually the most corrupt people in all of Los Santos, even by police standards, and they're a far worse influence to Los Santos than the gangs they're there to supposedly fight. They instantly frame CJ for the murder of a fellow police officer, and they basically tell him to stay in town, help them out on occasion, and play ball, or else. Well, that's a good enough hook to keep the character motivated, even if CJ had no other motives or feelings, which he does. This alone cements CJ as someone that will have to do the bidding of other people, and it's a lot more justified than it was when Claude or Tommy had to do it. But CJ has local police watching him and threatening him, and they will put him down for murder of a cop if he doesn't go along with this. Plus, while it's not explored in the beginning, Crash do use their police resources to keep CJ out of prison, since he is useful to them, so we get a nice in-universe reason as to why this mass murderer faces no real consequences. But since CJ is his own person with his own agency, there is a lot more going on here than just threats from the police. That's not the only thing keeping him here in Los Santos. The gangs here have fractured over the last 5 years, and Carl's home of Grove Street is now at the bottom, and this is because they're not touching drugs. The reason the gang is so strongly against drugs is because this game is set during the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, and just remember, the CIA are not your friend. Speaking of law enforcement not being a friend, this game does take inspiration from the 1992 Los Angeles riots, so just keep that in mind. But when Carl sees how the Grove has fallen without him, he does want to come back and help rebuild it to its former glory. Plus, it is clear that he did miss his friends and family, and while it is a tense reunion, especially with Ryder and his brother Sweet, who still hasn't forgiven CJ for everything, it is still nice to have CJ reunite with people that meant so much to him. His sister Kendall and the seemingly lovable Big Smoke are happy to have CJ back. Everyone is reacting differently based on their feelings, with Sweet being the most uncomfortable, which is a nice touch. Everyone feels like a real person, including Ryder, who is one here before being demoted to forgotten plot device later. Much like this video, the opening to the game really does drag. We get a lot of exposition and an incredibly slow build up to anything fun. In fact, there's even more exposition than a lot of people are even aware of because there was a prologue movie which barely anyone has seen and it's still not very readily available. You can find it on YouTube in low quality, and that might be your best bet because of course it was not included in this definitive release either. For the first several hours of this game, this doesn't feel like the fast-paced fun of GTA 3 or Vice City. I'd go as far to say it never feels like those games, even if from a casual glance it looks basically the same as them. San Andreas is by far the most story-driven entry on the PlayStation 2. And rather than giving us fun antics, we're just basically put in the shoes of CJ as he reunites with old friends and begins to rebuild Grove Street to what it once was. Early missions feel like their slice of life, but it's the life of a criminal. We attack a crack house, we get a haircut, we eat food, we rob someone's house, the usual stuff. The last two games did have opening missions like driving Misty, or going to the yacht to meet Cortez and then driving his daughter around, but those were basically one and dones, and the games really picked up their pace once they knew you could handle a car without it catching fire. You could look at San Andreas as a game that doesn't know when to take off its training wheels, but that is kind of harsh. I see it as a world that wants to build up a believable cast of characters and set up a comfortable world that will be swept up from under us. But it doesn't matter how I feel, because a lot of people do see it as the former. San Andreas is a beloved game with many people, but it is also divisive with people that preferred the quicker paced games of before. Most people do like it, but there is still a strong subsection of people that feel like this is too much of a departure and a true precursor to games like GTA 4, which is happy to bombard you with hours of tutorials and features no one really wanted in their GTA games. I'm kind of split on this. And I do mean kind of, because San Andreas is still my favourite GTA game by far, but it does ruin the simple charm of what Vice City accomplished and did so very well. But at the end of the day, this game does still have its own identity, and it doesn't go as far into the tutorializing and story as say GTA 4 and 5. This does still feel classic, just with extra bells and whistles. These tutorials do go a little overboard, and I do wish they'd speed it up whenever I replay this game. Plus our friends are reintroducing CJ to everything, and criticizing him for things like not representing the hood enough to help put me in the shoes of CJ and give me a much closer attachment to these characters. Characters in GTA 3 really had nothing going on. Characters in Vice City were eccentric and fun to watch, but they didn't really have too much personality when you really boil it down. But San Andreas really does flesh out its cast, and this really wouldn't be accomplished without all the meandering and pointless conversations. It's a balancing act. Sometimes it falls on its face, but I appreciate the effort, and I am quick to forgive it because of the mission quality of the game in general. Straight up, San Andreas has the best missions in this trilogy, or even the entire series. It hits highs the series never saw before, or saw again, at least at the time of speaking. Maybe GTA 6 will be good. Sure, we start off going to 2 different fast food places because one wasn't good enough, but by the end of the game, we'll be flying a jetpack out of a military base, and driving a motorcycle onto a plane as it's taking off, and then we have to parachute out. This game is amazing. But when I say it has the best missions, I mean some of its missions are the best. There is still tedious filler here too, and I would say, for example, Vice City is more consistently good, even if it doesn't hit those same highs. San Andreas later on becomes this fun spectacle so far removed from reality, but it never takes the player control away from us. These aren't scripted sections dictating everything where we feel like we can't mess up or else we'll just reload to a checkpoint 2 seconds earlier. And even when missions may feel a bit more scripted, I mean, come on, we're jumping out of a plane over the ocean and then hijacking another plane from midair. That's just cool, okay? I can forgive that mission for being boring on paper because it's just fun. But it does take a while for us to get to that point. San Andreas is split up into chapters of sorts, even if they're not so clearly signposted that way. We start off in Los Santos, which is a huge city by its own right, and it has many different neighborhoods and locales covered. But after some plot events, we're sent off to the rural outskirts with many small towns dotted across. The real focus is just all the green here. By which I mean wilderness. It's everywhere, it's kind of beautiful. It's a setting that's widely ignored in the genre, and it does make sense because there's not really much to do here and it's not densely packed at all. If a GTA game was exclusively rural, it would probably be terrible. But since we have both here, this is a fantastic complement to this map. It also serves as necessary spacing because San Andreas is an entire state. This isn't just a city. We need to have a bunch of nothing to really make the cities feel further apart from each other, and I feel this game did it quite well. While the map of San Andreas is by no means giant, especially by today's standards, this is one of the biggest feeling maps in a game of this genre. But this rural area isn't just a wonderful juxtaposition to what we've already seen, it really does help sell this fish out of water feeling that the game is going for, and that is emphasized even further with the next chapter, San Fierro, a smaller city, but is much more dense and filled with hills everywhere, and this is a match made in heaven for a series with this many high-speed pursuits. It's a turning point in the story as well. We get introduced to some of the most important figures in the game, like Woozy, Torino, and that guy that everyone, even his own voice actor, hates. But I have a soft spot for him. His missions aren't that bad, it's just the last one's kind of boring and repetitive. But once we leave this red bridged wonder, which actually in the definitive trilogy has updated its construction facts now that we have more polygons to work with, we move on to the desert up north, which is beautiful and underutilized. There's a lot of rural to work with here, and I love it. There's so many towns, but we generally just don't see much of this northwestern portion of the map. It's basically untouched, even though the towns are a joy to explore, and they do feel like the kind of towns you would see in this portion of the real world California and Nevada. So even though the game doesn't really care if you do it, just explore this area, it's beautiful. But really, all we're here for is the flight school, and a few of the zanier missions alongside it. And I'll admit, this is my favourite part of the game. I'm glad it doesn't overstay its welcome, but I do want more meat on this bone. The flight school here is what separates the new players to the people who have sunk too much time into this game. The flying is such a fun and thrilling change of pace, and these tutorial missions are things I come back to just for fun. These planes all feel different, and they're my favourite vehicles in the entire series. Whether I abandon them mid-air or do a more standard and boring landing, I never tire of these. There's a reason I like GTA 5, and it's not because I like overly linear and cinematic missions where you get no real choices. The flying school isn't the only school in the game either. We have driving and boating ones as well, which are fun bursts of excitement. The reason for these schools is that San Andreas has RPG elements, which is a choice I personally love, even if it once again does dilute that purity Vice City perfected. More on that soon, but I can't wrap up the locations without Las Venturas, the best of these locations. I love it, and okay, it's already over. I feel the game gets better the longer it continues, and it really peaked in this Nevada-inspired region. But this is also where the game really just wants us to spend the least amount of time. There aren't many missions here, and there are even fewer mandatory ones, since you can entirely skip out on the multi-missioned casino heist, which has fun missions like stealing the casino blueprints, or should I say black prints. Maybe I'm biased since I love this region in real life, and it really did make me appreciate the beauty of something seemingly as boring as rocks and dirt. And I am so happy to see it here in video game form. Or maybe it's just because this is when the game gives up all its pretenses and becomes this farcical, wacky adventure, kind of like a prototype Saints Row, but without all the bad bits. And it doesn't hurt that because the game is this far into it, we don't really get any more tutorializing. I mean, there is a flight school, but that feels fun and arcadey. I'm sure the development of this game wasn't designed in such a linear fashion, but it feels like they first made a giant map, then made each mission in chronological order, and by the time they got to the desert they realized the PlayStation 2 disc was almost full, so they cut out half the planned content they had here, because they did not want to lose all the fun of the opening hours, like learning how to drive a forklift, or how to burgle from houses, or how to put out a house fire, or how to have sex after a date. That is content that they did not want to lose, all this fun zany stuff that can go. And it really is a shame, but at least the game builds up to an incredibly satisfying area that far outdoes anything it did before. This game really does burn bright after spending hours barely lighting at all. Part of this build up is also achieved with the aforementioned RPG mechanics. CJ starts off being fairly useless in most areas, much like the average player of his games. But as CJ does stuff, his proficiency in that field increases, like in, say, Final Fantasy II, or for a reference most people will understand, Skyrim. And that Skyrim comparison is very apt, since San Andreas isn't an RPG either, even if it wears the skin of one. We can become a master in every single field pretty quickly, and it really does feel like that. But that also does mean that CJ becomes God in everything. This version of CJ, with maxed out motorcycle skills, won't fall off every time he hits an ant. He feels like he's a member of the Lost and Damned. He just keeps on driving without any interruptions. The other skills include a large variety of weapons, which is actually for each individual weapon, not even just something as simple as a pistol skill or SMG skill, or even more simply put, a gun skill. For example, you could level up each individual pistol that is in this game. There are a lot of bars to master here if you're the type of person that wants to experiment a lot, and this doesn't just do something as basic as accuracy or damage calculation. We get much more impactful changes here as your skills increase. We get better movement while aiming, which makes combat a much more fast-paced affair, since we can keep strafing and rolling out of the way of incoming shots. Plus, we can actually duck and move at the same time, which means we get a lot more movement and can hide behind cover if we so need to, but we're not relying on it. The game wasn't built around that, it's just how the systems combine. We do get other things like rate of fire increases as your skill develops, but the movement is what makes it. We start off as a basic Claude or Tommy, but by the end of the game, we can have much more complicated shootouts with much better movement. Being a master at arms isn't all we have to work on. San Andreas really did go overboard with all these extra mechanics that players don't really want. One in particular that everyone forgets about until they're told they can't progress the game without grinding it up further is lung capacity. San Andreas isn't just the first GTA that let our character swim, it also allowed CJ to swim underwater with an air meter that depletes quickly unless trained. I could see why they took this feature out of Vice City Stories and 4. I'm generally not a fan of how it's incorporated, but it does get used in some very fun missions, so I'm not against it. But this is one idea where I wish we didn't have to grind in a GTA game. It's a real pace breaker. Not everything has to feel like an RPG. But just swim a bunch, look at the more detailed but still ugly sea creatures, and before you know it, CJ can hold his breath long enough to progress the game. This is mostly used for some missions where we should be sneaking onto ships, which happens more than once surprisingly. And the stealth here is honestly a very fun mechanic. And we don't even have a stealth bar to grind, it's just something they put in the game without us having to work for it. I'm glad they had a little restraint left. The stealth is basic, which is fine by me since it's low on the list of things I look for in GTA, and it's usually an optional thing, but it is fun to play along with and it does change your approach. We can silently kill with a knife or with a silent pistol, and while it isn't complicated, it does work well, and it doesn't feel as ham-fisted as other games with annoying forced stealth sections. I feel like this is something they just included because they had it on some kind of checklist of features they wanted to include, and it was easy so it was included. A lot of San Andreas just feels like everyone in the company wrote down a feature for what they think could make the best ever video game, and then they just crowbarred it all in here without any consideration for how the game would actually be. The most needless addition here, but I love it so much, is the muscle and fat meter. CJ isn't just a plaything, he's a responsibility. Make sure he's in good shape. We can eat food to heal, which generally adds fat, and then running around reduces that fat. There is also a gym to speed up that process, and those gyms also have weights that can be used to build muscle, as well as teaching different fighting styles for melee combat, which is such a weird novelty, I love it. Muscle and fat each have their effect on CJ's stats, for instance how much melee damage he could do or how much health he loses upon a fall, but generally speaking, it doesn't really matter what CJ's muscle or fat meters are on a casual playthrough, outside of certain missions being unavailable until CJ starves himself and exercises, which is really unhealthy advice. I mean, we're just breaking into a military base, you don't need to be so fat phobic and trigger an eating disorder, that's not gonna help. Have you seen what overweight CJ can do? He's still a king. But I'm nothing if not persistent in showing the different variations of CJ here. which is why his muscle and fat constantly changes every clip. But it's not just his weight, there's also clothes and haircuts and tattoos to work with. San Andreas really wanted to allow the player to change up how they look as CJ, and I'm all here for it. I kind of see the default CJ as boring, but thanks to my help he's a fashion icon. We not only get to dress each part of CJ independently from the rest, meaning shirts, pants, shoes, hats, and jewelry aren't all lumped in together like the suits of Vice City, they can be mixed and matched. And they can be freely changed at any safe house, which this game has almost too many of, so it's not a pain to switch things up anymore. This was honestly the first game I'd ever seen do something like this, and I know it's not much anymore, but the amount of customization truly blew me away 18 years ago. And it's helped with gatekeeping? Okay, let me explain. Different clothing shops are only available to the player after certain story missions are completed. We can't be a tuxedo CJ during the opening hours. We need to play until we're at the point that CJ would be the kind of person who would wear those fancy outfits. The clothing choices get more upmarket as the game progresses, and while nothing is stopping CJ from wearing the same boring clothes all game, changing it up with the different styles that become available does help signal that CJ is a different person by the end of the game than when we first met him. He changed. Money changed him, and it's wonderful to see that subject explored by something as simple as not being allowed to go to a rich person clothing store until CJ is completely disconnected from his simple beginnings. Even if I don't like the real world implications of that. CJ isn't just a responsibility, he feels like a real person, and this shift in who he is evidence of that. Even if all the data mining I've done of this game has told me CJ isn't real, he still feels real to me, okay? But I have nothing bad to say about these elements, they're great. But that doesn't apply to the following. San Andreas didn't just stop at the kitchen sink, we have every mechanic they could cram in here. I'm surprised we don't have even more annoying features like having to calculate sales tax every time we buy anything, or needing to do a breathalyzer minigame every time we drive erratically. San Andreas, on top of having features like eating, stealth, working on each individual weapon proficiency, also has girlfriends, which is the worst mechanic added to the series. And it's not just a one-time thing since it did return in 4. This also gave an excuse for Rockstar to dump all the women here into this optional side part of the game, because basically the entire story is just men and your sister. There's no girl bosses here, we really peaked with GTA 3. That being said, CJ's sister, Kendall, is one of my favorite characters in the game and she is very likable. I love her. But on the other end of that spectrum we have Catalina, who on top of everything else shows us that 2004 audiences really did think sexual assault towards men was funny, which it obviously isn't, and that was genuinely hard to sit through. But even though I hate the game's dating mechanic here, it's basically just there for people who want to 100% this game. They can be miserable if they want to, that's not me. But it doesn't just stop at dates either. Have you ever wanted to control a crane? Well, if you played this game, you'd stop thinking that because it's tedious and even less fun than pushing rocks, which is also another part of this game. Most of the side content in San Andreas that is not directly from 3 or Vice City is pretty boring. But it's side content for the most part, so I don't really mind. This is a very meaty game without delving into all that optional content. This is a buffet where we can just fill up on what we want instead of going for everything and regretting it later. I don't care about the car customization or breaking into houses, but it doesn't hurt me to have this as an option, and it's not like this game is hurting from lack of time polishing the core experience. They were polishing the same game since GTA 3 years earlier, and while I don't think I'll ever go for it, especially since like 17 years ago I saw my brother read a GameFAQs guide and do it and be annoyed the whole time, as a casual player, I love the novelty of the hidden package replacements here, even though I know from a practical standpoint this is much worse. The prior 2 games had items to find for full completion. They were floating and stood out, but not so much that it's obvious. It's the kind of thing I don't really notice until I'm rewatching this footage and then I'm annoyed because I didn't see it the first time. Here, they're more contextual, these aren't just floating icons. The Los Santos area has places to tag graffiti, which requires the spray paint item. San Fierro has places to photograph, which requires the camera item. And then they just gave up because Las Venturas has horseshoes acting like hidden packages, and Anywhere Underwater also has oysters, which are basically hidden packages except they do increase lung capacity very slightly. Points for trying, but they didn't stick the landing. But at least the end of the game did stick its landing, as we have the city of Los Santos visibly rioting, which really does change how we relate to this once familiar location. Seeing all these people just so blatantly run around with things like TVs really makes this ending feel earned and dramatic. Shame we have to do one of the worst parts of the game multiple times here, just to progress the story. We have the gang warfare system where we have to make territory ours by basically just fighting waves of spawning enemy gang members, and really the only good thing I can say about these spawning enemy gang members is that they sometimes line themselves up in a convenient line, which means I can just keep shooting without having to try. Keep doing this over and over, and make sure no one takes over your areas as well, because these do fluctuate and aren't permanent additions. But this does bring me to one of the undeniably better features of the Definitive Edition. We have colorblind settings, which I've mentioned previously in GTA 3, but here this also extends to the different gang territories, which has some symbols on them on the map, so players can better differentiate which areas are Grove Streets and which aren't. This section of the game is already a pain for me normally. I genuinely can't imagine how much worse this was for people who had difficulty telling these areas apart, and hopefully this does help, and I do wish it was in the conversation more about these ports. And since I'm talking about Definitive Edition changes, I have a lot to go over. People say this is an insulting release, and while I may agree with it, it's still better than the Xbox 360 or updated Steam release from years ago, which was so bad people had to downgrade the Steam release just to play it properly. That's because the de facto San Andreas for years was just the mobile phone version ported onto other systems, but here we have Definitive Edition, which is the same bad phone version, but it's got some fancy bells and whistles, most of which I have discussed previously. But since San Andreas was the most changed in its phone conversion, it's subsequently here the most changed game in this trilogy. Some interfaces are laid out differently, which isn't a big deal, but it does feel weird seeing the entire list of food options at once at the fast food places. One of the weightlifting games was altered to be less button spammy, which is nice for people who can't or don't want to hammer a button, even if it does make all the weight options below the heaviest feel kind of worthless. And speaking of hammering, we still have the same hold to sprint option I mentioned in 3, but now that we have bicycles, things do get a bit messed up. Bicycles are the one vehicle in this game with the standard controls that aren't accelerated with the trigger. Instead we use the run button, which is how the game worked originally on PlayStation 2, but it does feel odd having one vehicle type only accelerate with a different button than all the others. This was especially weird for me, who used hold to sprint, which meant the bikes as well also were basically hold to sprint, so I could only go at the fastest possible speed and nothing slower. It did lead to some hype moments and I had fun with this, but it does make the bike feel less natural than it used to. The graphical changes are fine for the most part, there's nothing I really want to say about it. Sometimes it looks okay, sometimes it doesn't. GTA 3 was much more generic in this, and Vice City did look quite nice with all the neon and the clear water, and that beautiful purple sunset. But San Andreas Definitive here is just a more boring version looking of San Andreas. Really, the only thing of note is the fact that I guess Vice City used all the available purple sky, so we don't really have that purple nighttime sky in San Andreas anymore. It's a shame, but we did replace that with a beautiful star-filled sky, which I love, even if it makes no sense for cities like Las Venturas and Los Santos to have this, considering just how much light pollution there would be. A big deal was made at launch, and rightfully so, in regards to the draw distance originally. There was no fog, there were no clouds, basically you could see everything from one corner of the map. Thankfully that has been fixed here. The draw distance is still quite large. You can still see Las Venturas from this one town bordering the river dividing the two regions, but nothing is that bad here. And when we're in planes, we have clouds that are added to make it feel much less like an eyesore, and I actually do kind of like being able to see the entire state at once when we have the context of clouds making it feel like a less artificial world. Really, the only issue I do have here is in one particular mission we jump out of a plane, and during this cutscene for it, the plane is just hovering in place, I guess, which doesn't make any sense. We should have had some moving cloud textures. It was a problem when I played it during 1.0.5. Hopefully it'll be fixed later if it isn't already. It's just a minor blemish on an otherwise great package. A larger blemish is the musical selection being smaller than the original release, because of music licensing, which is a shame because the radio was one of the most impressive parts of this game originally, but even now with that loss, it is still quite amazing, even if it's not at its full glory. The radio hosts had so much to say, and their lines would change depending on certain events, such as where you were in the story, or what time of day it was, or what the weather was like in-game. I don't know why hearing the DJ mention the rain is so cool, but it is. Some things are even more substantial, like the radio station WCTR basically changing various times during the course of the entire game. And these aren't minor things, that station does go through quite a lot. This really does feel like an immersive world. Oh yeah, and there's songs on the radio too, I guess. Despite some absences, this is still a great lineup with a lot of diversity. We have rap and country to annoy the people who say they like everything except those two genres, but there's also 90s dad rock, which means we have songs from the 70s like Kiss, and we also have 90s dad rock, as in music for people born in the 90s, so there's Alice in Chains. But since it is the early 90s, we also have house, new jack swing, and the classics like funk are still there on the radio. Unlike Vice City, which generally used anything with a synthesizer for its radio, and served a very specific community very well, San Andreas goes for a broader appeal with a wider set of musical choices, so people will generally stick to a few stations instead of going between everything. That's just because they're cowards. They can't appreciate the joy of going from George Clinton to Patsy Cline. The missions in this definitive edition do still retain their checkpoints from the other definitive titles, but they are quite different here. They're simultaneously more and less generous. Most missions have multiple checkpoints now, meaning if we fail and quickly restart, we don't have to do all the boring stuff at the beginning. The mission will just pick up at the halfway point, for example. But the placement of these checkpoints isn't always consistent, and some missions just don't even have one for the very beginning. For example, failing to get into this boat on time doesn't just give you the option to restart, you need to go back to the mission giver and start it all over again. I don't necessarily mind this tough love as someone that played the original version of this game a lot, but if there's one game in this trilogy that makes me drive back to the other point of the map, why does it have to be the one with the giant map? And speaking of bad changes in Definitive, the jetpack exhaust things don't go spinny anymore, which is just really sad. That was part of the fun of them. But at the end of the day, despite some issues, including this game having the worst performance of a trio during the time of recording, but not necessarily now since it seems to be improved, this was a dream come true to replay. I loved Vice City Stories, and I played Liberty City Stories, and younger me just wanted a San Andreas Stories on the PSP back in my day, and we never got it, which in retrospect I'm glad for, because I can only imagine how terrible a San Andreas on the go would have been back then. But now I have it. Sure, the phone version existed for ages, but I have standards. All I use my phone for is typing these scripts when I'm in the bathroom, and opening up Dr. Mario World just in case them shutting down the servers has been an elaborate prank this whole time. I'm still waiting. I just wanted a good version of San Andreas on the go, and even though it's not a perfect version, or even a definitive version, like the title suggests, it is still a good version, and I can take it anywhere. I can take it to the couch or to bed, the options are limitless. These games are crude, juvenile, and not the masters of satire the writers probably think they are. But they're still comfy games that meant a lot to me when I was too young for them, and they mean just as much to me now that I'm honestly probably too old for them. Revisiting this definitive trilogy has been a meaningful experience, especially after dusting off the PSP trilogy last year. But I'm only left with one thought. When are they going to port the ugly enhanced version of Bully to something other than phones? Bully is like the best game Rockstar ever made.